Someone once asked me one time if when I write and prepare a message, because just naturally they asked me if I like write humor into it because it somehow I fit it in there, and I say no, that's just me being stupid. So I say that to say this. Yeah, really getting you excited, right? I say that to say this. When my dad, pastor, mentioned that they were going to start a series on Wednesday nights teaching through the book of Romans, the letter of Romans, I warned him. I was like, first off, do you know how big Romans is? That's not James or Titus like we've done. That's a hefty amount of writing there. And then I also said, do you know what's in Romans? Like, there's some big, deep stuff going on there. And he's like, oh, yeah, it'll be great, you know how he's so positive, and he's probably going to listen to this and call me. But this might be the last time I ever teach. No, but then last week, and, the Spirit moves. We have an awesome testimony service, and prior to that, I didn't know I was teaching, and so he comes up here and speaks for like 5 minutes about like, hey, we're going to talk about Romans, and gives you a little brief introduction, and then says, all right, Clayton's going to teach next week, and I'm like, do you know what's in the latter part of Romans 1? There's some crazy stuff going on. What are you doing? And so he left me, skipped out of town. It's like he planned it to have his anniversary this week or something. I don't know. And so you're stuck with me. And if I offend you, you can take it to him when he gets back and tell him it's his fault for making me speak, right? I say, yeah. I do want to preface this by saying, I want to honor what his intention is, and so when I say teach through Romans, I think that's really what he's wanting, and so this probably isn't going to be very sermon-esque, and honestly, as I think about it, I'm probably more, I guess, adept to teaching anyways, rather than preaching, and so it's not great, but you're getting probably the best I can do, and so I do want to take a small amount of time, because we didn't get a lot of time in the text last week. And I want to spend a small amount of time just kind of setting up the series and the letter, because we were unable to get very far because God had other plans, and that's awesome. And I must confess, I've never taught through the book of Romans, and probably for the reasons I mentioned earlier, it's like, it can be a little intimidating, to be honest, and there's some stuff in there that, people that have, degrees and a lot of education and are very smart, a lot smarter than I am, differ on opinion of interpretation on some of those. And so there's, when we study this, there's a few things, and this is for tonight and for the weeks to come, when you study through any scripture, but definitely when we're studying through the letter of Romans, I encourage us that we would have maturity, wisdom, and grace as we dive into this text, okay? All right. So Pastor shared last week, just kind of a little brief about Romans, that the letter of Romans has had some major impact on some early church fathers in history of the church. And he mentioned a few stories, specifically a couple names that in church history were deeply impacted by the letter of Romans. St. Augustine, John Calvin, Martin Luther are a few men that, if you study much about church history after the disciples passed away, these are some men that were influential, huge, impactful men on the church as a whole, and their writings and their teachings and everything they accomplished. And all of those men beyond have talked about the impact that Romans had on them. And when I say impact, I mean like changing their lives when they studied Romans. I believe it was John Wesley. When he was preaching, he would have Romans. He would read through Romans every week, Even if he wasn't preaching it, it was his practice to read through it every week. And so I'm just telling you all that to tell you Romans is a very impactful letter if you read through it and study it. And so for me personally, I'm going to lay out a few goals, okay, for us as we go through the book of Romans, and at least for tonight and hopefully for the entire time we do this. When we finish this time of study and when we finish going through this letter, there's a few things that I think we should look for, and I say all that to say that Romans should change us, me included. When we study through the letter of Romans, we should not look the same when we start. It should change us. And so here's a few things I wrote that I think Romans will do to us as we study it. We'll see Jesus more clearly. We'll understand the gospel more thoroughly. We'll pursue grace more passionately and feel it deeply. We'll hate sin more completely. And finally, we'll understand more fully than we ever have the large story of God's purposes for the world and his faithful achievement of those purposes in spite of evil and sin. Studying Romans should change us. And so as we dive in, I do want to just, because I'm not going to dive into the very first because Dad mentioned it, Paul wrote the letter of Romans. I just want to start there. Paul wrote the letter of Romans, and it's widely believed he wrote it while he was in Corinth, and you can read about his time there in Acts 18. And so he wrote this letter, and I think Dad mentioned this last week as well. He had never been at this time when he wrote this to the church in Rome. Okay, so he's writing to a congregation he does not know well or has not been to. And when I say does not know well, it's not that he didn't know anybody, because he obviously did know people. In Romans 16, he spends a whole chapter greeting everyone he did know. So it's not a completely unfamiliar people, but it is an unfamiliar church. And so he is writing to a church that he had not yet visited himself. So we have some groundwork laid. I want to look at verses 14 through 17, start there. And these verses can honestly be viewed kind of as like Paul's thesis opening statement. Like this is where he kind of lays out his vision for the rest of the 15 and a half chapters. His purpose for the remaining of the letter. It's like a big overview Paul gives of what he's going to be unpacking. So I'm going to start in verse 14. It says, I am debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. So as much as in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation. Amen. To everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. And like I said, we could spend the rest of our time in these three verses, but we'll never get through Romans if we do. And so Paul's really kind of given a big overview of what he's going to talk about. And I pulled out three things here that I think are like Paul's purpose for writing Romans out of these three verses, okay? The first one is from, in the first two verses we read, that he's writing to clarify the gospel, okay? He is going to give a fully comprehensive overview and in-depth study of what the gospel is. And he's going to clarify what the gospel is in this letter. So he's writing to clarify. If you're going to be a follower of Jesus, a Christian, you need to know what the gospel actually is, right? Brother Packwood mentioned last night in men's meeting that there's times that we don't preach the whole gospel. And it's important as followers of Jesus that we know and proclaim the good news, the entire gospel. And so he's going to clarify, and if this is a church he's writing to and he wants to visit, he's going to make sure they know 100% what the gospel is, okay? He's clarifying what the gospel is. The second purpose I think he's doing is to unite the church together. He's going to unite the church together. I get this out of 16b where he's talking about the Jew and the Greek, and you're going to see that Jew and Gentile language all throughout the letter, okay? It's everywhere. Jew and Gentile this, Gentile and Jew this, okay? There's a reason for that. You'll see in Acts 18, actually, we get a little insight to this in the first couple of verses. Paul meets Priscilla and Aquila, his ministry companions, and they are there in Corinth because they've been kicked out of Rome, okay? So in AD around 49, the year around 49, Emperor Claudius, giving you a little history here, Emperor Claudius set out and said, and basically exiled all Jews from Rome. You're out. moving day, right? And Priscilla and Aquila, Paul's companions, were actually of that group that had to leave Rome. Now, they were exiled, kicked out, left Rome, and we don't know what a whole lot of information of what that looked like, but we know that it was a pretty significant number of Jews had to leave Rome. And so Claudius kicks them out, and about 5 years later, he dies, and they are allowed to come back. Now, I say that to say this. When they left Rome, the Jews were pretty much in charge of the church and the things that were going on and all that. Well, now they left for 5 years, and Gentiles are in charge. And they come back to this church, and it don't really look like the church they left, right? Because they had their Jewish practices and customs and the things they did, and the Gentiles were not observing all of those things. And so, as you can imagine, if you read through some of the scripture, there's a little bit of tension between Jews and Gentiles. And I say that jokingly because there's tension all the time. It's crazy, right? It's like a lot of the Bible is about the tension between Jews and Gentiles. And so they come back to find the church not how they expect it to be. There's tension there. And so it's believed Paul wrote this around 1 to 2 years after they were coming back. And so he's writing here to bring unity into the church. And part of that is by clarifying the gospel to them, that he's going to bring unity to the church. These circumstances kind of motivated Paul to write this letter, it's believed. And then the last thing that I think is kind of a purpose, and that's from verse 17 that we just read, is that this is a big part of what Paul wants to say about the gospel is proving God's righteousness. Proving God's righteousness. And he's going to do this in two ways, two aspects, I guess. In a legality way, about God as judge. He has integrity as judge. He is faithful and righteous as judge. And then the other way is that God is righteous through his covenant and his faithfulness to his people. Okay? I know I'm dumping on you a lot, but just hang on, there's more to come, right? And so he's writing, and these are some purposes, some reasons why Paul's going to write this letter. So I do think it's important that we know that. We know what Paul's mission is in this writing. And so he's writing to clarify the gospel, he's writing to unify the church, and then he's writing about proving God's faithful or righteousness. And so from here on, Paul's going to dive right in, and we're going to do the same. We're going to see these purposes unpacked all throughout the rest of Romans. So here we go, right? And I jokingly said, Dad, thanks for teaching enough that I have to go into the ugly stuff of Romans 1. But here we are. And so verse 18, Paul jumps right in. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Now, verse 17 we just read talked about the righteousness of God being revealed through the gospel. And the next verse tells us about how the wrath of God is revealed. Yippee, right? The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. So this wrath of God, he gives us a lengthy description. Okay, he's gonna expound on this. So he's gonna dive into how the wrath of God is being revealed. And first off, it's revealed from heaven. And the idea is simple but sobering. God's wrath is revealed from heaven against the human race. And the human race deserves the wrath of God. And he's going to tell us why. But the human race deserves the wrath of God. Now, sometimes I did want to say this because we're going to talk about this a little bit. Sometimes the wrath of God is like a subject that we equate kind of because we understand human anger. But when I'm talking about wrath of God, it's not motivated by like a human anger that would be motivated by selfish reasons or personal reasons or a desire for revenge. Nothing like that. When I'm speaking of the wrath of God, it's completely righteous in character. God is righteous, and his wrath is based in his righteousness, okay? And so when I'm talking about the wrath of God, this is not God being mean. This is him being righteous, okay? I wanted to say that. Andrew Murray said his wrath is the holy revulsion of God's being against that which is the contradiction of his holiness. That's a mouthful. But God's wrath is a part of his righteousness, okay? So Romans 1:16, Paul spoke of salvation, but what are we saved from, right? And so Brother Packwood mentioned this kind of last night, but first and foremost, we are saved from the wrath of God that we righteously deserve. Unless there is something to be saved from, there is no point in talking about salvation. So Paul's got to start right here. Here's why we need salvation. The wrath of God in this portion of the letter, Paul's goal is not to proclaim the good news, but to demonstrate the absolute necessity of the good news. Okay? He's not here to proclaim the gospel yet. First, he's got to tell you why you need the gospel. And I know, hopefully this hits home a little bit, because sometimes you might witness to somebody, evangelize somebody, talk to somebody, and it's like you don't even understand why you need Jesus. Right? Like, there's the saying, you got to tell someone they're a sinner before you can actually get them saved. Like we gotta convince them that they need saving, right? And so Paul is going to do that. And his wrath of God is revealed against two things: ungodliness and unrighteousness. That's what it says. It's against two things. Ungodliness is a life that disregards or ignores God, either by rejecting Him specifically, or by living their life as though there is no God. Does that sound familiar? Ungodliness? By either rejecting God specifically or by living your life as though He does not exist. And then unrighteousness, evil and immoral behavior. Okay? Those are the things that the wrath of God is revealed against. And then this next part, who hold the truth in unrighteousness. This other translations, and they kind of said the description of this would be like suppressing the truth. Okay? This is men who suppress the truth. You guys ever been in a swimming pool or a body of water and you try to hold a big inflatable ball under the water? It wants to pop up, right? And you're pushing it down, trying to keep it under the water so it doesn't pop up. That's suppressing the ball down. And it says that these men that have the wrath of God has come against these men who hold the truth or suppress the truth, pushing it down so that it cannot come out. That is what he means. So this picture of someone holding this truth, that it doesn't come out. This is not by accident. It's intentional. You catch that? You don't suppress that ball underwater on accident. It's intentional. You're pushing, you're using force. And so the men that he's talking about, the people that hold the truth in unrighteousness, that suppress that truth, it's an intentional suppressing. This is not like, oh, I didn't even know I was doing that. It's like, no, you know you're doing this, okay? So he's continuing to expound on why humanity is guilty and deserves wrath. And so I actually put together partially for my benefit, because I don't know about you, but sometimes when we get into this depth, I like some visual aids. So I kind of, and you probably can't see that very well, but it's 19 through 23 is where we're going to jump into next. So it says, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. For the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to a corruptible man, into birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. I say all that to say, and we're going to dive into these verses. Paul's telling us we have a problem. You ever seen the movie Apollo 13? You know the famous line, right? Tom Hanks. Yeah. He's up there in space and radioing back to NASA. He says the famous line, right? Houston, we have a problem, right? And just like that, Tom Hanks becomes a superhero. But no. Paul's basically saying, and we're going to dive into it more, but Paul's saying, world, we got a problem. Humanity, we got a problem. Mankind, we got a problem. And I'm going to lay out a few different problems, but verses 19 through 20 tell us that God is not unknowable. He's not. He's revealed Himself. In fact, He's graciously revealed Himself. His invisible attributes are clearly seen, it says. Do you think about that? His invisible attributes are clearly seen. Isn't that awesome? His invisible attributes are clearly seen. His eternal power and divine nature are revealed in what He has done. They're revealed in what he has done. I like that word, eternal power. We get that word power, actually, you've probably seen this before if you studied a lot of Greek, but it comes from dunamis, and it's always associated with like power or ability. And so it's talking about the ability and the power that God has is being revealed because of what he's done. You know how to show you're super strong? By lifting something super strong, right? And so it says, God's dunamis, his power and ability, has been put on display and clearly seen because of what he's done. Okay? And then it's eternal because it wasn't like, your superhero that gets his magical powers by falling into some crazy chemical thing. But God's always had the power. So he's eternal. It's eternal power. And so this power that God has is on display because of what he's done. And it's eternal because he's always been able to do it. It's not something that it came upon him. But he's always been able to. And so he has eternal power. Paul's not letting the world off the hook and declaring just because you weren't given the law does not mean you get a free pass because God has revealed himself to everyone in his creation. Hey, God's revealed himself to you in creation. If you didn't have a Bible or religious indoctrination, God would still be revealed to you through creation, through what he's done. I heard someone once say, men don't just believe in God because they're told to, but believe in God because the universe and life itself testify to the Creator. You don't have to be told to look outside and go, there's something going on here, right? And then verse 21, it's not that the issue is that the people do not know, it's that they do know God and choose not to honor him and show him any gratitude. Did you catch that? That they knew God and glorified him not as God. It's not an ignorance where I don't know him. It's I know him and choose not to honor him. That's where the wrath of God comes in, right? I know him and choose not to. It's to choose not to put God and honor God where he is, and then to not show him gratitude is offensive in its highest measure. It's offensive. It's like looking up into the heaven and recognizing we were created. We have the sense of we should be doing something for him, except we say, you know what? I think I want to do my own thing. That's what he's saying. You know there's a God. You look up, you see all around you that there's evidence of a creator, and yet you look up to the heaven and say, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and go my own path. I'm doing my own thing. I'm going to figure it out on my own. I'm not going to give God any of the glory. And so we kind of say, I can do things rather on my own. As a result of knowing God, but yet disregarding him, he's been replaced with anything else, lifted up in his place. What do we call this when something takes the place of God? It's idolatry. A root issue, idolatry. An idol is anything that in any way takes the place of God in our lives. And anything you serve, you love, you trust in, you die for, it might just be an idol if it's taking the place of God. And it can be anything, and a lot of the times it's something that seems good. Chesterton, well-known theologian, said that when people stop believing in God, we don't believe in nothing, we'll believe anything. And then John Calvin called the human heart an idol factory. Seems pretty fitting. An idol factory. We just produce them. Seems on point. He continues, though, Paul's not letting up. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. I want to tell you, sin doesn't make you smarter. Sin doesn't make you smarter. Sometimes we think sin is smart and sophisticated. It's not. And I think about some of the language you use, and I've heard the example of like, you're around people and they want to go out and do something that you don't think is honoring to God. And you're like, no, I'm not going to do that. And they're like, what are you, a child? Like the grown-up thing is to go and sin. But sin is not smart. It's not sophisticated. And verse 23 told us that people are elevating creation, giving creation the credentials that belong to God, putting creation where God should be. We have an idol problem, an idolatry problem. And I would argue that Paul has just revealed the root problem. But it's not the entire problem. He's going to keep going with the world. So he's going to keep building on this. And so for the remainder of our time in this chapter, we're going to see Paul develop the problem with the world. But our first problem is that people replace God. It's an idolatry problem. People replace God. And we're going to continue building on that. The next thing, verses 24 through 28. Wherefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up into vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lusts one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. The next problem we have is that God judges men by releasing them to the consequences of their sin. You want idols? You want to go your own way? Not acknowledge God? Reject Him? Live as though He does not exist? And God, 3 times there, is not on accident. God gave them over. God gave them up. God gave them over to these things. You're going to reap the consequences of the sin that you're going to jump into. And so God does not choose evil, but He's permitting our choice as well as the consequences of that choice. It says 3 times, God gave them up. It's not there by accident. And in His righteous wrath and judgment, God gives man up to the sin our evil heart's desire, allowing us to experience the self-destructive result of sin. We quote it all the time, that sin is pleasurable for a season, right? Just a season. And after that season is over of pleasure, you reap the results of the consequences of the destruction of sin. And so it says God gave them up. God gave them up. Hosea 4:17, God's expressing His judgment, and literally He says, Ephraim is joined to idols, let him alone. And that's kind of what you see happening here. They're given up to it says God gave them up, God gave them up, God gave them up. They're going to go their own way. I was thinking a little bit when I was playing high school football. I was a lineman. Obviously, I wasn't running the ball. And I was a lineman, and so I liked offensive line. There was a thing that we did. We would run the ball a lot, and so something that we did as linemen is you don't want the running back to get hit by the guy you're blocking, right? And so you want to get in between the running back and the defender. And so how to do that is you would take steps in order to reach that guy before he could get to your guy. And so you would try to step in a way that if the guy's running over here, I want my back like this, so this guy's got to go through me to get to this guy, right? Basics, right? Well, there's this thing these defenders love to do when you're an offensive lineman. They want to do this thing they call slanting. So what that means is the guy's going to line up facing you, but as soon as the ball's hiked, he's going to pick one side or the other of you and try to get through there faster than you can get to him. And it's a slant. You're slanting across into a gap. You're trying to get past the guy that's supposed to be blocking you. Well, we always loved that, and the coaches would tell us, now, naturally you're wanting to get around, but if that guy slants like that, then just take him where he wants to go. You catching me? So if the guy comes in and slants, and he's running this way, well, I'm just going to grab him and just keep taking him this way out of the play. And so I kind of got that image in my mind as I'm thinking, as the guy that's just running himself out of the play, and I can almost see, as it says, God gave them up, God gave them up. It's like, you're just running yourself out of the play. You're just continuing to go further and further away from the place you want to be. And so the people that have been given over to idol worship are now reaping the consequences of their sin. And so this freedom, with air quotes, this freedom to disobey should be seen as God's judgment, not His kindness. Those who engage in such acts, it says, are receiving in themselves the recompense or the penalty of their error. They're reaping their consequences of their sin. And so God is judging the people. He's judging the people who are living in this lifestyle. It says God is judging them. And he builds off this. In verse 28, we just read it. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over, there's that, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. This is kind of interesting, but you can say this next time someone's really not doing well and just say, your mind ain't working right. See how that goes, right? Your mind don't work right. Your mind's messed up, right? But this word here that he's using as a result of God's judgment or his allowance of people to basically go the way that they want to go, as further judgment, God gives man over to this reprobate or debased mind, so that things that are disgraceful and sickening are readily accepted and approved. It's twisted. It's a twisting. And so the word debased or reprobate originally meant that which has not stood the test. You failed the test. And it was usually used about testing coins. If a coin did not meet the correct standard, it did not stand the test. And so it was those coins that were below standard or below value and therefore rejected. And it says God gave them over to a reprobate mind. The idea is that since man did not approve to know God, then they came to have an unapproved mind. I don't recommend trying this out on your coworker, but have you ever worked with somebody or talked with somebody that maybe has been living a life in sin for a long period of time, and they make these decisions and things, and you're thinking and you're talking to them, and they're in this pattern, and it's like they can't even think straight? Possibly they can't. Possibly they can't. Maybe they've fallen into the category we're looking at here. And I was thinking about this, up is down, down is up. And then when they come out of it, hopefully they come out of it, and at that point looking back in their past and they go, what was I thinking? Right? What was I thinking? We got testimony back there. What was I thinking, right? And so don't trust your thinking. Don't trust your thinking. This is especially, God has given them over, and it says God is judging men, and that he's given them this reprobate mind. Their minds aren't working right. It's not working right. They're twisting, and the things that should be so offensive are approved. And I hope some of this you're going, man, that sounds like more of our culture than I would expect. And yeah, it does. We definitely don't see are not lacking examples probably of what we're talking about here. And so, thank you guys for continuing to put those up. I forgot about it. People's minds are not right. They're given over. They're failing the test. And then he continues in verses 29 through 31, being filled with unrighteousness, all unrighteousness, fornication. This is a great list, guys. Just hold on. Fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable and unmerciful. This list is giving concrete examples of the kind of things which are not fitting. Right? Are not fitting. And did you notice that there's like the socially acceptable sins, like, covetousness and envy and pride, but then they're placed right next to the socially unacceptable sins, like murder? Paul's like, hey, we got a problem. We got a problem. A couple of these words, covetousness, like the itch for more, never content. Whisperers, these secret detractors, those who, under pretended secrecy, carry about accusation against their neighbors, whether true or false. Envy, this small sin, so powerful that in a sense, and I when I was studying, this was just like, wow. This power of envy, Pilate knew that they handed him over because of envy. Matthew 27:18. It put Jesus on the cross, envy did. Proud, they who are continually exalting themselves and depressing others, magnifying themselves at the expense of their neighbors, and wishing all men to receive their sayings as oracles. In other words, look at me and how good I am. I say all that to say this. Our next problem is that people do evil things. People do evil things. We just went through a whole list, but it wasn't the whole list. People do evil things. Which leads to the last verse. Who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Let me just tell you where we're at. We have an idolatry problem. As a result of that, God's judging men because of it. And through his judgment, people's minds aren't working right. And through that, people are doing evil. And now we come to this point where they're not just doing evil, they're celebrating it. Did you catch that? But have pleasure in them that do them. There's a celebration of the evil doing. People are celebrating the evil. You see where we end up, right? You start replacing God, making idols in your life, and slowly you start seeing the buildup to the point where not only are you participating in evil doing, but you're actually celebrating the evil that's happening. And if this doesn't fit close to home, right? We literally live in a culture right now that celebrates evil doing in so many different facets, but celebrates evil lifestyles, celebrates evil sin. And I said all this, and we kind of see the progression that Paul goes through. And he's saying idolatry leads to immorality. Okay? When you replace God, guess where you're going to end up? Doing evil. You're going to end up living an immoral life. Oh, I'm a good person. Really? I don't follow Jesus. I don't have anything to do with God, but I'm a moral person. No. When you have idols in your life, it's going to end up where you're living an immoral life. If you don't have God where he should be in your life, then you're going to end up being immoral. It's the natural progression, Paul says. So we see the consequences daily of what idolatry leads to. And while it's not completely a behavior issue, like that's not the root, right? Idolatry is at the root, but it's not completely a behavior issue. Our root problem of idolatry is expressed through our behavior. And then, not even through our behavior, but our celebration of these behaviors. We're expressing our idolatry and how we've disregarded God through the evil doing that we're celebrating. He says, those who either practice or approve of these things are worthy of death. That's how serious this is. They're worthy of death. And they are the worthy, and I'm saying this, they are the worthy targets of God's wrath. It is the righteous thing of God to do that his wrath would be on them. No one's innocent. In fact, I'm not going to get into chapter 2 tonight. And everyone says, praise God. But I'm not going to get into chapter 2 tonight. But Paul begins with saying, because it's probably more likely when the Jews are hearing this read and hearing all the things that Paul is saying here in chapter 1, he's probably going, the Jews in the congregation are probably going, that's right, preach it, brother. These guys are messed up. Look at all these Gentiles. They're messed up. So Paul starts off in chapter 2, and he's like, hey, you're messed up too. In fact, you have the law, and you still can't obey. You're worse than them. So he says, oh, you who judge. So that's how he begins chapter 2. There's none innocent. There's none innocent. We're all deserving of the wrath of God. In other words, we have a major problem. That's what Paul's saying. We've got a big problem here. A major problem. We have an idolatry problem. And it's the root of everything. We have an idolatry problem. We have replaced God with anything and everything. We and our hearts are messing up. I heard this illustration. It's so good. You guys ever got a squeaky cart at Walmart or at a grocery store? You guys enjoy those? You're liars. No, I'm just kidding. You get a squeaky wheel at Walmart, right? And you got 3 good wheels, and that other one's like needing Jesus, right? And it's just like squeaky. It's going to the right, and you're like, what is going on here? And you're frustrated because you're, running into product and kids and people, and but you're trying to fight this cart, and if you're me, you're like, yep, I'm done with this thing. I can carry my groceries, right? But you're trying to push this squeaky cart, and it's just bent on going this way because of that wheel. And the illustration was so good. We are bent towards just going. We can't go straight. We're going towards idolatry. We're bent towards that. Paul's going to get into this sin nature that we have. We're bent towards replacing God, towards thinking that we can do it on our own. We're bent towards that. We have a problem. We have a problem. That's the direction we tend to go. And we deserve the righteousness of God, or the wrath of God, sorry. The righteous wrath of God. We deserve the righteous wrath of God. Look at the evidence. We're convicted and guilty. Paul just laid it out. Hey, the wrath of God is revealed through ungodliness and through unrighteousness, and we're all doomed. And he just laid it out. We have a major problem. We're bent towards idolatry, and as a result, we're evil people, and we end up doing evil things, and we end up even celebrating the evil stuff we do. Because we're messed up. We have this problem. And the worst thing about it all is we cannot do anything about it. The Jews have the law, and they still can't do anything about it. We're messed up. We have a problem. We're just doomed. God's wrath is inevitable. It's coming. There's nothing else that we can do about it. No wonder why Paul was so eager to preach the gospel. No wonder. And not ashamed of it. Because he told us in verse 17, that's what's going to reveal the righteousness of God. He said that's what's going to reveal the righteousness of God. And so we're in desperate need of a solution here. We got a big problem. We got an idolatry problem. We deserve the righteous wrath of God, and we deserve it in a bad way. And we can't do anything to help ourselves. Every time we do, we just mess it up. And we're in big trouble. We are in desperate need of a solution. And luckily, fortunately, God has a plan, and we'll see you next week.